Hello, everybody, and welcome to another very exciting episode of Cards on the Table, the podcast brought to you by the Excellence Hub. And I am absolutely delighted to be joined by my very special guest today, Radha. Radha, hello.
Hi, it's so lovely to join you today.
Great to have you. So, can I just check, did I pronounce your name properly? Is it Radha?
You did, Luke. You pronounced my name exactly as it should be. It's Radha. I know it's spelt Radha, and a common mispronunciation is Radha, which I think I have kind of accepted my whole life until adult life, and I've become more comfortable with actually saying, no, the pronunciation of my name is Radha. It's a Hindu name, which is quite unique given that I'm not Hindu, but it's a name that my parents obviously really liked. It's quite a famous name in India because Radha is one of the deities of one of the gods, Krishna. Um, so yeah, it's quite a meaningful name in the Hindu religion. So yes, that's the correct pronunciation, Radha. So thank you for pronouncing it correctly.
Well, and thank you for sharing the story and the origins of that name. So, you are a phenomenal human being, one of the youngest global majority Hettites in this country. You're a history buff through and through. You're a massive supporter of the women ed movement within education. And we've got quite a bit to talk about. So, rather, the way that Cards on the Table works is I have some physical cards. This isn't just a metaphorical thing. That I will select and we'll use those as sort of starting points for our conversation. For transparency, we have selected the first card together, which is history. So when I say the word history, what does that mean to you? What triggers in your head when you hear that word?
When I hear the word history, I get a really warm feeling because it's my comfort. It's something I love. It's something um, when I'm studying that particular subject or when I'm out and I'm about, everything can link to it for me. And it's something that I've always found huge meaning in. So, if you say the word history to me, automatically I'm thinking, well, what period of history, what time, where are we going to, where's this adventure taking us? And yeah, so it just fills me with lots of curiosity, warmth, and comfort because it's something that, yeah, it gets me excited, that word to start, actually diving a bit deeper.
So what drew you personally to history as a subject then? Where does your love of history come from?
Um, that's a really good question, actually. Probably not the traditional answer that I'm going to give. Actually, I wasn't very good at history at school. It was a subject that I was completely switched off to. I think if my history teacher was to probably watch this podcast, she'd be like, yeah, that was you with your head on the table sleeping in class. Um, but I think that was part of the problem. It wasn't engaging at school. It was something that, I was reading out of a textbook. I didn't quite grasp learning in that way. So actually, history at school wasn't something that I loved. And I remember the night before my GCSE being like, I don't know what I'm going to write. And my dad was like, well, it's a bit late at this point. And I just took a book off his shelf, started reading, and I was like, I think we've done something on Hitler this year. I'm going to read this. And just started regurgitating that in the exam. And again, I'm sure we're going to unpick that itself a
Well,
little
it's a
later.
good job that this isn't like a podcast on revision tips or
No,
metacognition, because
exactly. And I
if so, we
missed
should probably
and
cut
I
that out right now.
misstart this with when I'm teaching my students. And then somehow got an A in that exam. Don't know how, but actually probably looking on back on it, I do know how because I just recalled and recited those facts that I'd crammed the night before. And then I thought, well, that's the subject I got an A in, so maybe I should do that for A level. And actually, as I did my A level, I realized that actually this is a subject I really love, and it was the component of Russian history in particular. And I just found it so fascinating, and I just loved like the culture and the architecture and just all of it, everything about Russian history that I was studying. I just thought, wow, this is great. And I really then started to apply myself and started becoming really good at it. And I was like, well, actually, I'm doing all right at this. Um, and then decided to read history at UCL for my undergraduate, and particularly with an institution C, so it's the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies, where I could focus even more closely on European and Russian history. So I just loved that. I just followed what I loved, and so ended up doing quite well at that. And then I did my dissertation on looking at the lost children and the orphaned children in communist Russia. And I always had a passion to work with children. So I always knew I wanted to become a teacher. And I always thought I'd become a primary school teacher. But then as I fell in love with the subject more and more, I was like, actually, I want to become a history teacher because I had a really bad I was sleeping in my lessons. Like, this could be really great for kids. Like, we could really make this come alive. Um, and that kind of then just took me naturally to where then I started teaching history. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I loved making Anderson shelters in the classroom and bombing them with the kids. I loved making, paper ball nuclear missiles as we learned about, ICBMs, etc. And getting them to understand, the Cuban Missile Crisis and why it was such a big deal that, the Americans had put missiles in Turkey and the Russians had put missiles in Cuba, and getting them to literally throw paper missiles at each other for them to understand, that physical distance. And yeah, I fell in love with my subject, and I wanted children to fall in love with that subject, and for it to come alive in the classroom with them. So yeah.
I think there'll be people watching this podcast now having heard the notion of the physical representation of a missile crisis and paper balls being thrown, and they'll just be wincing, thinking that I've got my PowerPoint sequence to follow and everything else. But it's really interesting. You mentioned the love of the subject, and you and I
Yeah.
spoke offline about this regarding the entries. And when you look at the entry patterns, both at GCSE and A-level history, they're going the wrong way. Well, wrong way, I guess, from your perspective. They are
Yeah.
decreasing. And I think since there's been a slight rollback on the EBAC, there are less humanities entries, perhaps more broadly. But why do you think we've got far fewer, and it is far fewer pupils taking history to GCSE and A level rather than perhaps was the case a few years ago?
I think there's not one single cause of that. I think there's a number of reasons, and I think part of that comes down to, there is a lot of content that needs to be taught in such a short period of time, that, even going back to when I was at school, that can feel very overwhelming. And, you know, it's about the preparation up to that as well, isn't it? From, primary school, year seven, year eight, year nine, preparing children for that. And being able to, not just have to recall memory facts the night before an exam. And I think for a lot of children, because the examination process kind of is like that to succeed, that's quite daunting. I have to learn all these dates, all these facts, all these figures. Um, and I think that in itself is a pressure. I think that's a pressure as well for staff, which is why, year on year we see same content being delivered, or same courses or options being taken, because I think there's such a wealth of volume to teach, and you want to teach it right, and you want to teach it to the, best of your ability, and, for the children to be able to digest that and understand that then, you know, thinking of switching courses to a different module becomes really overwhelming in itself for teachers as well, because, oh, I'm really comfortable with teaching Nazi Germany, but actually, if you now are telling me I have to change and we're teaching about the Roman Empire, for example, um, that's like, how much work have I got to put into that? I've got to redesign things to make that engaging. So I think that in itself is problematic as well, because you don't have the luxury of the time to be able to do that as teachers. I think if you were given that time or space to be able to create that, then I think a lot of more teachers would opt for that, and then maybe more students would opt into those different modules where they think, oh, actually, do you know what? I never have learned about ancient Greek civilization, or we did that in year four, and that was really great, and I'd love to do that in more depth. But instead, it's perhaps I'm just going with Nazi Germany because, year on year, that's one that's always taught. that, oh, actually, we did a little bit of that in year 9 when we did World War I and World War II. So, you know, um, do I really want to take that? I know a little fair amount about that, or I didn't enjoy it. I don't like contemporary history that much, or, I think there's lots to it, and I think. Yeah, I think for students, especially speaking to my students and listening to them, a lot of them will say, "Well, I'm not really good at history because," and it's so much to learn this.
Mm.
It's just so much to remember, and
But it's
I
also,
just
and you touched upon it there, it's almost like multiple different subjects within the same subject domain, because
yeah,
typically GCSEs will be medicine through time, Elizabethan era,
yeah,
Nazi Germany, perhaps American West, three from those four. And if you
yeah,
look at the awarding body specifications, like the number of different options and configurations you can have,
yeah,
it's like looking through an old Argos catalog. There's
yeah.
page
It
and page and
absolutely
page.
is.
And so I'm really interested to get your sense. There's been quite a lot of noise online recently about the importance, what's more relevant, subject knowledge, pure pedagogical skills, and the truth is it's sort of a moot point because both, please, and a lot of both. But in terms of subject knowledge for history, I guess it must be very tricky to transition from Romans, Greeks, Aztecs, medicine through time, Elizabethan, like all those things. And so, do you think sometimes one of the problems perhaps is actually staff subject knowledge, they perhaps stay with just their own security rather than other topics, other areas that may be, dare I say, more interesting, more engaging, more beneficial for children?
Yeah, exactly that. I think that as a practitioner, you master the subject knowledge for that particular course or component, and you then year on year, grow that knowledge. And I think when you're then comfortable, the pace at which you have to deliver it, then because you have that confidence in that knowledge, you're able to deliver it at that speed in which it needs to be delivered. And I think there's a problem with that though as well, because you get to know the course inside out, you also then kind of expect the kids to know the course inside out. And sometimes the great thing about learning a new component is that you're not learning it with the children because you'll always be a couple of steps ahead of them, but actually you've gone through the struggle of actually I didn't quite understand what that particular phrase meant, or that particular part of I don't know, that policy. So you dive into it to a bit deeper. So then you're teaching yourself to then know how to teach the children it. Whereas let's say you're 5 years into teaching Nazi Germany, and the concept of cumulative radicalization, let's just talk about that. You think, oh, I've done a great lesson on that, that worked really well last year, but you've got a different cohort in front of you and perhaps they haven't grasped it as well. There's no time to go back to that concept, and you'll just think, well, it was a great lesson, it was cracking, my kids did all right last year, so they'll pick it up. And I think you can fall into that where you do a course year on year because you're confident and comfortable. But on the flip side of that, as your confidence grows, you're better equipped to deal with some of the children's questions
Yeah.
around, but why is that? Or I don't quite understand that. Um, so yeah, I think a little bit does come down to that as well. Yeah.
Okay. So rather, we are recording this in July 25, and at some point in the autumn, the curriculum and assessment review that's been led by Professor Becky Francis will be finalised and published, which may or may not result in changes to assessment, curriculum content, because of course it'll just be recommended to ministers. Whether it gets changed or not is for that body. But if you were leading that sort of curriculum and assessment review, just with that lens on history, what would you change? If you take the national curriculum in history, what do you think? Do you know what? That's out, that's in. We need to look at that through a different lens. What are your thoughts on all of that?
The loop. Um, I think in terms of history, and the curriculum, I think there should be a little bit more flexibility around like topics that like the way that the exam boards put the topics together in the I can't think of the way they classify it in the
Yeah.
units. I think there should be a little bit more flexibility around that, because some of the subject options around like the breadth study, for example, you might want to do that particular option as a depth study. I think there should be some more flexibility around that. So you've got more options and components to choose from, rather than like, you're going to end up stuck with medicine through time, or, warfare through time, which may not be engaging specifically for your children. But actually, if you did a component on, I don't know, medicine in the early 19th or 20th century, as a depth study, that might be really great, because you could look at loads of different things that children would find fascinating, like, the emergence of plastic surgery, or, those sorts of things, instead of having to learn it all the way through as a breadth study. Um, I think in terms of the actual assessment side of things, a lot of so so when children are writing for the exam paper, there is quite a stress on, in terms of like their ability to write analytically and evaluatively, which I think are great. They're really important skills. But I think there should be some element as well where, we children do naturally fall into kind of like a recall narrative. And I'm not saying we should have a question on there where they're just, and I know some examples have moved towards being able to recall and tell a narrative. But I think there is some, you know, merit in children being able to recall that information. And I don't necessarily think that they should be penalized if that's not conveyed in a real clear peel structure, for example.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think if they have understood and got a sense of that time, and contextually that time in history, isn't that great? Shouldn't that be acknowledged, that a child can immerse themselves in that time period and really understand, like, that's what they lived like, that's what life was like? Isn't that what studying history is about? I would also like to see, like, perhaps the amount of components that they have to do reducing, so that teachers can actually have the time to really dive into parts of history. Let's say you are doing Nazi Germany, for example, everything is so tight. Like, where is the time, or even the Cold War, where is the time for that creativity to be able to, like I said, make an Anderson shelter, or do nuclear bombs in the classroom? Like, where is that time to get that dopamine going for those kids, for them to really connect with their learning? um Often it does become about recalling information and getting that down. So I think if there was that breathing space for teachers and for pupils, I think much more effective learning would take place.
Okay, so more breathing space, perhaps fewer domain areas, but with greater time to really explore and go deeper.
Yeah.
And so I guess if I follow up from that, then do you think there are any periods or topics which are underrepresented in the current national curriculum or through those various GCSE options?
um Yeah, I think that, in when we think about the primary curriculum, you've got so many great topics. Like, you talk to the kids now, they'll remember what they learned about the Romans and the Greeks, like they'll remember it. Um, or the Aztecs, they love these topics. And I do think that there's not enough of that option to explore those more kind of ancient civilizations within the history curriculum. I think as well, we stick to quite, like Mao's China or Stalin's Russia or Nazi Germany. But there's not always an opportunity to explore, different, like, parts of African history, for example. We have quite an onus on, American history, British history, or like kind of Russian history. Like, they are the kind of three main ones that lots of children schools will pick, and children will learn about, which is great because they have a place for that as well, completely. Um, but I do think, exploring those parts of the world would be, great as well, or Aborigine history, that would be great. Um, and I do think as well, I know that there is the component, and a lot more schools are doing the history of the Middle East, which is, great. but I don't necessarily think from my own experience of teaching pupils and even up to today that they necessarily understand that link between what's going on in the Middle East back in the 1900s to what's happening today in 2025.
Yeah.
And I think just being able to explore that in greater depth would be great as well for them to understand. Or, even if it's Eastern European history, I mean, lots of children currently, what's been going on in the news with Russia, Ukraine, there's that opportunity to explore Russian history under the Tsars or communism, but then there's not much opportunity to explore the impact of that on the Eastern European countries, those satellite states. They understand that they were satellite states. They understand that, how life was for those snippet moments where we look at flashpoints, Hungary, Cuba,
Yeah.
um, but they don't actually understand really, well, what was life in Ukraine and why is this such a big deal today?
And I
So
think
yeah, I think yeah, just to summarize that, then maybe some more opportunities for ancient civilizations to be explored at a deeper level beyond the primary curriculum, and maybe at a deeper level, some alternative countries as well, and the impact of, those bigger powers and what life has been like in those countries too.
it's always really encouraging to meet someone who is at heart just a proper subject bod, whatever your subject is, right? Geography, French, science, in your case, history. Because when I said to you, what thoughts, what words do you associate with history? It's like warm, happy, and just hearing you talk about we want more time, we want to do X, Y, Z. It's awesome. I guess the challenge is one of pragmatics because there's only so many hours in a day, there's only so many years in a child's education. But what you'd want, if we genuinely are serious about developing young people with really good global understanding before they go into the world beyond their school in whatever town or city they're in, to just transition slightly, and it's a nice segue from your previous point, is about the subject known as ancient history. And you and
Mm.
I had this conversation previously because
Yeah.
primary curriculum starts with those ancient civilizations, and then obviously history tends to be taught in a sequential manner and a chronological manner. Now, there is a GCSE in ancient history. And when you and I spoke offline, we looked at some of the topics, and as a non-history bod, I was just like, my God, they look awesome. It's not that contemporary history and GCSEs don't, but I remember thinking at the time, oh my gosh, wow, and that would be a natural build on from primary. But hardly anyone takes ancient history as a GCSE. Just what are your thoughts on that? Why might that be?
I think that again, there's a number of reasons for that. And I think part of that is that, like I said, teachers are comfortable with the content that they have and they've been delivering. And modern history tends to be an area where, perhaps they've studied at school, or they've got a bit more of a greater understanding of that, or there's more resources around that. So it's more easily accessible, readily available. They've got resources. So that's not going to cost the school. So let's run with that. I think, to then change your curriculum to something that's, let's say ancient history, I think there's a few things around that. One, how do I get the kids engaged with that and keep that relevant to their lives today? Because you can see it in the classroom, kids saying, well, what do I need to know about this for? I don't care. This happened thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, nothing to do with my life. And I think it's being prepared in how you deal with those conversations and how you're equipped. Um, I think also it requires on your part as a practitioner to be able to have that, like I said, time to really understand that history and make that history come alive. So I'd always like, let's say we're talking about the Romans and we're talking about architecture or structure or, changes that they've made. The first thing I'll always say is, everybody heard of the A1? Yes, we know the A1. Right, it's a Roman road. Isn't a, it started with the Romans. That's how much the Romans have impacted our lives, that we're still using, things that they created today. So I think, and it's being able to bring that history alive and know where those resources are, and
Yeah.
funding to be able to afford those resources or take the kids to the trips on the Roman baths or things like that. Because I think children also want to see how it's relevant to their lives, but also and how it's going to benefit them. Um, And I think it's also about staff being able to have the confidence to deliver that with, the confidence of the subject knowledge, but also the confidence to know that, actually I need some resources on this. Can we afford to buy a new set of books that's going to be about Roman history, for example?
Yeah.
When we've got stuff on, I don't know, Cold War since the last 10 years, and we spent loads of money on those books. So I think it's a
Um,
practical thing as well.
and so if we were to wrap up this particular section, if you think about the next 5 years, and what history may or may not look like in terms of the curriculum assessment review, new history teachers coming through, different pedagogical approaches, subject knowledge, and all those things. What would you really hope? What would make you feel really positive about your subject in 5 years' time if certain things perhaps were put into place now?
Then the first thing that would make me feel so happy is that there was not such a drive on the amount of content in the amount of time that's delivered. Because I would love to walk into a history classroom where a teacher is making that subject come alive and have the time to really go into something with a child instead of delivering history death by PowerPoint. Because we've got to get through this content and you need to know it for your exams. I think that would be the number one biggest change for me. And I think if we can change that, then I think children will start to love this subject again. And they will feel like, I can't wait for history because, we're going to get to learn about this, this, and this. And we're not just going to have to copy down from the board, or we're not just going to have to write some questions from the textbook, or we're not just going to have to read loads and loads of stuff at home because we've got to keep on top of what we're learning in school. And I think when you win their hearts like that, they'll put in the extra mile and they'll go and do that reading with no resentment or feelings of this subject's just too much. I have to learn so much because actually a lot of that learning will be memorable. You will say to them, well, of course we learnt about ICBMs. Do you remember that lesson where we were chucking grenades, at each other or missiles at each other? And they will remember that learning for the rest of their life. That will hopefully then spark a love that when they are adults, that they think this is something that's quite cool. I want to find out a bit more about that. And you're giving them the skills and the tools to be able to do that, to find out about civilizations and life before us of their own free will. Isn't that what we want in the long run? Not just somebody who can pass an exam in history and recite facts about, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We want adults who go into the real world and go and visit the Colosseum and think, wow, this is amazing. What kind of people were here? What did they do here? And they're asking those questions for themselves, and then they are going to look at the answers for themselves. And I think that would be the biggest change.
What a lovely warm ending to our first topic. And as I said, that subject passion is just resonating through the screen. I'm going to pick another card at random from my
Okay.
table because there are a few. Just to be clear, this isn't like tarot. There's no death card. There is an Ofsted card, but we get that or not. Okay. The next card, rather, is DEI. So when you hear those three letters said in that order, where do you go to? What thoughts go into your head?
Um, I think just a space where everybody can thrive and be who they are. I think that's the first thing that comes to my head is DEI is all about creating spaces where everybody can be who they truly are, um, in a authentic way. Yeah.
And one of the things I was going to ask you, because obviously DEI previously was known as EDI,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on the shift and the reordering and the significance of that?
To be honest, I don't have many thoughts around that. I just think it it means the same thing. I know lots that will be controversial for some people. I know that, you know, the shift in the way that it's said, DEI, EDI, the goal is the same thing. The goal is to create a safe space for everybody to feel that they can be themselves, they are equal. So yeah, doesn't personally bother me if people say EDI or DEI. I'm okay with either.
Yeah. And there's a term which, I said at the beginning, you're one of the youngest global majority head teachers
Yeah,
in England. Now, some people might not have heard the term global majority. Do you just
yeah.
want to explain to people who might not be aware what that phrase means and why that's so significant?
Yeah, so the term was coined by Campbell Stevens, and the so previously people from ethnic backgrounds firstly were called ethnic minorities, and then the phrase BAME came, which was Black, Asian, and minority ethnics. Um, then the term shifted to being used to global majority. And I think actually, when I was looking into the use of that particular phrase and why that phrase is so empowering, I began myself to feel really empowered by using that phrase because actually, when you think about it, when we're looking at the globe, when we're thinking about people from different ethnicities, they actually aren't a minority. They make up the majority. And I think by using the phrase a minority, you can often feel quite isolated, quite different. Oh, I'm the odd one out. But actually, when you think of the term majority, no, I'm actually just like everybody else. I'm actually, you know, I'm part of this globe and we're actually a group of people. um, so I think it brings people together. That's the first thing. It feels less isolating. And yeah, it's for me, it's a really empowering term.
Yeah. And one that should be perhaps more known than is currently the case, because for some people
Yeah.
it's still not a phrase that
Yeah,
they're familiar
and
with.
still, even when we've got the DfE reports, the phrase ethnic minority still used. So yeah, and I think I could talk about this, Luke, for a really long time, and why that should be changed, and the narrative around that, and what narrative is trying to be conveyed and created, and looking at a lot of British colonialism and going to the history of that. But I think that yeah, you're right. It's a term that perhaps should be used more widely, but perhaps isn't being. Yeah,
And I guess I'm going to sort of link back weirdly. We've just been talking about history. We've just been talking about history as a subject, the academic origins of history. And of course, there's a natural link between history and DEI because, you mentioned perhaps some of the more Eurocentric historical topics.
yeah,
Um, I remember in a previous role doing a big diversity in the curriculum piece, and it was really quite
yeah,
intriguing, when you look at, for example, paralleling stories of perhaps Sikh soldiers in World War One, World War Two, and yet those stories are never told, even though the
yeah.
events are the same. So, just what are your views on if we just talk your subject and DEI combined, and what sort of things do you think should be happening right now, rather?
It's really hard to talk about what should be happening when I think at a higher level um, that narrative is still not ready to be told. So I think that the curriculum, I mean, and I know this, we're talking and this is like, quite an open conversation, but I think, ultimately, if we start teaching, like you said, those parallel stories, um, I think that would become perhaps problematic at a higher level. I think there is certainly a narrative that um, the government wants in terms of even if we look at let's just take the story, the history of the Middle East, for example. Okay. Um, I think that it's great that that's part of the curriculum, but I think that actually we need to look at the British involvement in that a lot more as well, and how conflict in 2025, whilst that's being driven in the media and that very much looks like a war between Israelis and Palestinians, I think we do need to be aware of the British role in that. I think we need to be aware of the British role in, lots of conflicts that continue within the world. Let's just think of Black Lives Matters movement. How many people are aware of, why that movement is so important. I know lots of people pushed back with, well, all lives matters. Um, so when we're thinking about EDI and or DEI and where that fits into the curriculum, I think until at a higher level we can start having the conversation at a policy level where that narrative changes and genuinely changes. I don't know how many changes can be made within the curriculum. I think staff are quite constrained by, the resources that they have and the narrative that is being taught.
And um, I think there's some really insightful points. And if I reflect on the work of people like Benny Cara,
Yeah,
who
she's
do
great. Yeah,
phenomenal work
yeah,
regarding more inclusive, more representative, more diverse curriculum, and rejecting tokenism and it being part of
yeah,
an authentic diet, which links to your point about developing global citizens. And really good example is the topic of space. All right, so space in
yeah,
science isn't even part of the national curriculum. All right, it's optional. Forget that. But when you talk about space, pretty much every school's got a photograph of Tim Peake, which and rightly so. I'm not knocking Tim Peake. I've never met Tim. Tim, if for some bizarre reason you're watching this, I think you're a good bloke, and he did a wonderful thing for this country. But Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Tim Peake, three white men. No one tells the story of Kalpana Chawla,
yeah.
the first Indian woman in space, which is a remarkable and tragic story. It's about having collective ownership and collective responsibility. And you're right, then you would then go back to subject knowledge where people may not be aware of that story. But
But
I
I
think,
do think, Luke, people perhaps aren't aware of that story because of the narrative that is being pushed. So when you look at DEI work and you dive a little bit deeper and you look at, what's actually who's making these policies and who's sponsoring and who's donating money to the government and kind of controlling that narrative, actually they hold fundamentally racist views. We're looking at, and I'm not going to name names, but we're looking at, major donors to particular governments that hold, views of IQist views where, they genuinely believe that global majority people have lower IQs than people who come from white backgrounds. And these are the people that are funding our governments or sitting, on our panels that, determine what is on our curriculums. So I think until we can start chipping away there at a higher level, that's when we can really start pushing, more kind of a diverse curriculum. So yes, I absolutely, bow down to everybody that is doing DEI work and adding things to change the curriculum and fighting that fight. But I do think it has to be at a higher level as well at this point, and that's where kind of my own DEI work's coming in. That I'm hoping to be able to have a seat at that table to be able to have a bit more of a voice around those conversations.
yeah. And I think, the truth is I feel quite awkward and uncomfortable as a white bloke even having this conversation. But I think my job and my role in this is to also, number one, support, and number two, be an ally.
And that's
Because
amazing.
yeah,
Just supporting and being a gatekeeper and being an ally, is one of the most powerful things you can do. So I think, yeah, that's fantastic. If more people could have that mindset, that would definitely help more global majority educators to stay within this career because let's face it, we know global majority retention within education is, I know retention within teaching itself is problematic, but actually global majority retention it is a higher rate. And we know a lot of that comes down to, the overt and covert racism that they experience during their teaching career. So yeah, I mean, being a supporter, a gatekeeper, an ally, that's one of the best things you could do for a global majority educator.
well, at the Excellence Hub, we champion that, and you know that yourself. And it's interesting because part of the majority we're talking about diversity within the curriculum and things, but if we're talking just inclusion, for example, we then look at like the work of Sally Bolton and her work regarding menopause in
Yeah.
education. So, I appreciate we went down one particular avenue, but the truth is there are so many
Yeah,
opportunities for people to offer allyship and support where it's needed, frankly.
absolutely.
But I guess if we then 2, 3, 4 years' time, where do you think, or where do you hope we will be in terms of the DEI work in education in England? What do you think would be, do you know what, that would be a good place for us to be at on the journey? Because the journey won't end, by the way.
So I'm gonna like specifically in terms of global majority educators, that's a lot of what my research is around. I hope that the journey is that we have schools where staff feel included, where they feel that that is a safe space for them to be themselves, and actually in hope that they don't necessarily have to progress within their career because they have had somebody who has been a gatekeeper or, necessarily an ally, but actually they've been able to progress within their career because we're all on an equal footing, genuinely. So for me, that's like kind of the end goal where, like we go back to that point, what does DEI mean? Well, it means a safe space, where all can thrive equally. So for me, in that respect, that's where I would hope for it to go. In terms of a curriculum, I would love to see, I'm going to speak about my particular subject, more the curriculum being embracive of lots of different cultures, where it's not a narrative which supports simply, the British history and what Britain has done. That doesn't mean that, we have to apologize for all those things. That is the past, but let's teach it as it is. It doesn't mean that we have to shy away from that history because perhaps we didn't do the right things in the past. We have to keep it contextual. They were the things that were seen as acceptable during that time period. So let's teach it as it is. So yeah, I think that's where I would love to see things going in terms of global majority educators and particularly my subject.
So rather, if there's a head teacher, a trust leader, a chair of governors watching this podcast, and they're realizing that perhaps some of their recruitment practices may not be fit for purpose, what sort of advice or guidance can you give them on how to be able to attract, recruit, and then retain global majority educators?
Oh, attract, recruit, and retain. Okay. So I think the first thing is that in terms of attracting, um, celebrate the diversity within your trust or your school. So, for me, when I've gone to an interview, for example, I've always looked at the staff board, always. So if they've got a staff board, I'm there, I'm looking who's in this school. Is it all white? Are there global majority staff? That makes a difference to me as a global majority educator. Am I going to be the only person of colour in this school, or actually is this a community? So I think celebrate in whatever way you can, whether that's a staff board, whether that's don't go over the top where it's like, completely just creating a facade, but celebrate. So, if you're doing Diwali with the children at school, because that's what you do year on, year out, and that's a genuine thing in the curriculum, celebrate that in a newsletter or online, show that you're celebrating differences or your inclusivity. So that's the first thing, because when you're going for a job, they're looking at your website, they're looking at your marketing brochures that you've sent out, they're looking at your staff list, all of those things. So I think you don't need necessarily to go over the top on an inclusion page. Include it. Just do what you do. And if you're doing it, it will be evident. So that's the first thing. Um, in terms of retaining, I would say that you certainly need, like you said, Luke, more people that are there supporting, championing, mentoring, and being a gateway, a gatekeeper, and an ally. So and calling things out so that staff genuinely feel like, no, this is my place. This is home. This is my place. This is where, I should be. I'm accepted here. So I think those things and encouraging them to have a voice. So, lots of global majority educators, for example, will, feel like we talked about that tokenistic person, or part of the process. Oh, I'm just here because it's, I'm the token person that to make sure that their recruitment process has been fair. So I think, genuinely include them into your environment. Um, like one thing, I'm just going to give an example. Like it's not just about including staff, it's about pupils as well. So, schools where children have Ramadan, for example, what are those children doing? If that question got asked, would you be able to genuinely, as a head or senior leader or teacher, say, oh, we do X, Y, and Z for those children that are on Ramadan because they can't have lunch? Or do those children just go off and sit in a room and what are they doing? It's small things like that. And so that staff member, if they are Muslim, for example, is going to say, well, what about when it's Ramadan for me? Am I going to be accepted? Is it going to be awkward? Is it what's going to happen? Will I be given leave for Eid or will I not? Those sorts of things. Yeah, so I think that there's some things to retain. And then, sorry, Luke, what was the last
No,
bit?
no, no. It was
Recruit, retain, and
it was attract, recruit, and retain. It's my own fault because I managed to put seven questions into one, which is a skill of mine that I need to unlearn really, really quickly.
and then a skill of mine is I just carry on answering.
No, but I think it is just being to a head part of a trust, and the trust was putting on a really lovely event for staff, kind of a thank you, a celebration at the end of the year. It was held in a pub, and it was free drinks for staff, without anyone just realizing that, well, 15% is when their head said, but 15-20% of my staff, they just won't go because it's in a pub. And so it's also, you're right, it's also just having it in your prefrontal cortex, not in your subconscious, that this is about everybody. And if it's
Yeah,
good for everybody, great. If it's not, then perhaps we need to rethink why we're doing things.
when we're thinking about recruitment in particular, and we're thinking about that interview process, we know the facts are the facts. 4.5, I think percent at the moment is of senior leaders or head teachers are global majority. That's a really small portion. So the rest we know are from white backgrounds. So inevitably, when we have panels, governors panels, interview panels, head teachers, whatever, whoever's on that panel, often than not, they're going to be an all white panel. And from my experience, often as well, the majority of them are men. So I think it's during that interview process as well, being aware, hang on, you know, there is nobody here particularly representing that person, whether that's a female, whether it's somebody who's, in their 40s, whether it's somebody who's disabled, whether it's, any of those protected characteristics. We don't have somebody here who necessarily represents that person. So how do I represent them or their voice, within this environment? How do I make them feel comfortable to feel heard, that this is a genuine process and they are valued through this process? So yeah, that's one last thing I would say, because often not, more times than not, when I've gone to interview, there's nobody there that could champion my voice or that would align with me and know how, many more challenges I've had as a female, a young female, and a global majority young female, in that room, and what my journey has been or led to, and how many more obstacles I've had to face just because of those protected characteristics.
And I mentioned earlier about my what I can do as a white male is to be a supporter, is to be an ally, but I can't pretend for a second I know what it's like to walk in your shoes. Now, you just touched upon it there. Just would you like to share perhaps some of those experiences from interview, from recruitment that you've touched upon? And I guess if you walk into a room and you see three white men in their 50s or 60s, what are your first thoughts when you walk into that room as a potential candidate?
Yeah, I think my first thoughts are, often, at times I will feel dread and like, oh, okay, I'm not going to get this role. And I think the way that I can sum it up is, having had a conversation with a senior leader who, actually I have a lot of respect for and still do, absolutely. When I tried to explain that this was my experience of what had happened, and it was, the response was, well, we're so diverse. Look at the students, and sometimes people say things, and you've just got to toughen up. And I think my response in that moment was, yes, but look at the staff. I'm one of like however many hundreds, and I'm the only global majority person. And actually, when it comes to who I am, I can't change that, and I can't toughen up to that because I just am who I am. I can become smarter. I can get plastic surgery. I can do, but I can't change who I am, and I shouldn't feel that I should have to. And I think, you know, that was a hard lesson for me. And that drove my passion for DEI work. But going back to, that is what fuels in my mind when I walk into a room of, let's say, three white males who are over 50, that I think, oh gosh, genuinely, I think a lot of these people here will believe that it will just be on merit, and often it's not. Often, it's not just that. So yeah, I think I will always have those hesitations just because of my experiences of, remarks that have been made or comments where they people that I've worked with haven't necessarily understood the place that I'm coming from as to why that would be a problem or why that's affected my life. And so I would just encourage any of those people that are in that room to just have an open mind and to think, I need to be an ally here, and I need to show them that I'm an ally in any way that I can. And even a simple thing, Luke, like, did I pronounce your right name correctly? Is that how would you like your name pronounced? That shows you're an ally because you care about the most, simple thing, but actually the most meaningful thing to them, their name.
Yeah.
And that makes a
And I
huge
think,
part of somebody's identity.
I guess there's so many thoughts and so many possible things that will offshoot from that. One is, I guess, proper training, and I mean proper training
Yeah.
for, governors, trustees, particularly those who are volunteers who often get called into interviews who aren't themselves of the
Yeah.
sector, as well as actual proper training for senior leaders in schools and trusts so that they
Yeah.
understand the significance and the importance of this. And something just dawned on me, I guess, if you said if you walk in a room as a candidate and you see three white blokes in their 50s, it sort of fills you with dread. You're probably not going to perform at your
At
optimal
your
level.
best. Yeah, because you already think it's a write-off. I'm
Yeah.
not going to get the job.
And so, even just in terms of your ability, whatever scoring matrix any interviewer has, right, you're already at a disadvantage because you're not feeling confident. You
Yeah.
can't relate. Um, yeah, in the way that if I walk into a room, and this is very different, if I walk into a room and I hear another northern accent, part of me
Yeah.
just relaxes.
Straight away, you're like, oh, yeah.
Yes, I just something feels familial, something
Yeah.
feels comfortable. So whilst I'm not going to like, in terms of race or heritage, the experiences you've had regarding gender, but I relax a little bit. I feel more comfortable. And I guess what you're trying to say pragmatically is make everybody feel comfortable, but
Yeah.
particularly those global majority educators who are themselves in a minority of educational leadership roles in
Yeah.
England.
Yeah, exactly that. And how you do that will be very telling for that candidate to really show their true potential. And like I said, it could be the smallest thing, like how you've started today with, have I pronounced your name correctly? Or, and just automatically that will make somebody go, oh, okay, yeah,
Yeah,
they care about actually me. They care about how to address me, not just how they want to say my name, or how they think my name should sound, or what's easier for them to pronounce. They
yeah.
actually care about me, and straight away, a candidate will feel more welcomed.
And actually, even picking up on that point, because you're then, as a candidate, you're in sort of a difficult situation because if somebody mispronounces your name but doesn't ask you, if you then correct that person, which
Yeah.
is, by the way, is the right thing to do, I would say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Somebody else might, frankly, take offense to that. And then already thinking, do I, don't I? But either way, you're not then focusing on the interview
And
because
I
you're
think in
distracted
my
by
early
examples.
career, I would never have corrected anybody because you just want to you just Professor Paul Miller talks about this a lot in his work about assimilating and adjusting and kind of just fitting in basically to be able to survive really. um and I would have been that. I would have done that. But now, as I enter a room, I'm more confident just through my experiences and also the level that I've reached as being a head teacher to be able to say, it's rather, but and I just correct them in that way and just kind of move off over it and gloss over it really quickly. Um, but I don't think somebody, fresh in their 20s coming into their career very early would necessarily have the confidence to do that because they want the job or, you know, there's a lot riding on it, or they just don't have that confidence to speak up in that way just yet.
Yeah. And rather, number one, I'm so grateful for you sharing, I guess, your own stories in relation to DI, your own lived experiences. Um, but what you've also provided there for people listening is some really good suggestions on how to make their schools, their workplaces more inclusive, more welcoming, of others irrespective of background. So thank you so much for
And just
sharing.
watch out for my research on how they can do that more. That will be
Well,
coming out shortly on
we will
how
do.
schools can make their schools. And don't get me wrong, there are some great frameworks out there, and I know Vinnie Lander at Leeds Beckett University has done great framework for the initial teacher training, and that's great. And NUT has done a really good, NEU, sorry, has done a great framework. But that embodies a lot around students, but some more work needs to be done around how to create schools, to become more inclusive for global majority educators, and yeah, how they can do that to keep retention with those educators.
And not only are you our history teaching and learning expert at the Excellence Hub, but your DEI research will be filling in. And we're recording this in July, but in the autumn term of 2025, we all look forward to reading that and hopefully genuinely improving the inclusivity of
Yeah,
our workplaces.
hope so too.
Rather, I think we've got time for two more random cards that I'm going to pick.
Yeah.
So who knows where we're going to go? We've had history, we've had DEI. Hopefully, we don't get the Ofsted card. No offense to anyone in Ofsted. Oh, a random one. Childhood. Childhood. Tell me about your childhood. What was
I
what
feel
was
like we're going to be in a right therapy session now, Luke. My
just
childhood.
to be clear, I'm not a trained therapist. If I ain't a trained therapist, so what's
And
it? You also don't.
anyone after this who thinks I may need therapy, reach out.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, tell
okay.
what does the word childhood mean to you?
Okay, so my childhood. So I think that when people meet me, they wouldn't necessarily match me up with the childhood that I've had, or my experiences. So whilst I'm very, very proud of my academic achievements, um, going to Cambridge University, going to UCL, all of those achievements, achieving my master's. Um, I think my childhood would not have predicted those outcomes for me. So it might be surprising for lots of people who may know me be watching this that actually my childhood was one of what we would consider disadvantaged today. Um, my family are very much working class, and something that as I was growing up, I felt quite ashamed of in a way, because I ended up later at private school, which I'll talk about in a moment. But actually now as I'm an adult, really proud of. And I think that's because of my journey with my DEI work that I've been able to embrace my identity, my culture, and my childhood. Um, so I went to a school which was predominantly EAL, and today predominantly SEN. And yeah, I was, living in what would be considered disadvantaged background. But my parents both worked and they were really hard workers. My grandmother was amazing. She worked in a factory, chocolate factory. My grandfather came over. He worked in the brickyards. We were a family of God, loads of us living in a three-bed terrace house. And I don't know really what my parents' aspirations for us were other than to just get through school and don't cause trouble. You know, that kind of was their aspirations. And um, my parents, my dad, I think, has a couple of GCSEs. They certainly don't have A levels. They didn't go to university. Um, but one thing we had was an abundance of love. And so I would never have known that I was living in what we would consider disadvantage because my childhood, as far as I was concerned, was amazing. I got to live with, and around my cousins.
Yeah.
Cousins were next door, sometimes living in our house. It was great. I was with my cousins all the time, with my siblings all the time. And then my grandmother, she's a matriarch and she was quite a force to be reckoned with. And, culturally, she did things that perhaps weren't seen as the norm, where she separated from my grandfather, something that's not accepted within our culture or our community. But she wanted a better life, to break away from, just the stigma of that community and also like just what was expected of her as a woman to just put up with stuff. And so she said to my dad, she encouraged us to go to for private education. Now in my culture, again, girls having an education is not something that's valued. um so she was like, they're not going to these schools around here, they're no good. The only good school is private school. They're just, we're going to get them in. We're going to do it, whatever. And he had to go work abroad. He worked really hard, so he was quite absent. And my mum was just amazing. I don't know how she dealt with four kids. I can't deal with two. um, but again, they were all around. Everybody was around, living in the same house, so it was good. Um, so yeah, I then went into private education, year seven. I felt very different. I felt very out of place. I didn't understand half the things they were learning when they were learning Latin. I mean, I just, used to float through maths in school. Um, so often ended up putting my head down in class, not understanding the difference between mean, mode, median, would end up crying. Nobody at home could explain it to me, it's not quite comical. Um, so, because they only needed that, they just needed to know how to cook, how to look after the kids, how to, and then dad would just go out and earn the money. Um, so I struggled at school a lot. And I was a July baby, so I was always felt like I was trying to keep up. My parents actually did. They confessed on the lawn of Homerton College where I was graduating. Yeah, we just didn't really think you were going to go to university. We just thought you might just work in a hairdresser or something. I said that'd be great as well.
Yeah.
But like I said, I don't think they had high aspirations because I don't think they necessarily were encouraged to. Um, so that was my childhood, and I found it really, really difficult during my private school years because, again, I was like a sore thumb that stuck out, and I found that hard to navigate being
So,
around
so rather, I
those
mean,
communities.
there's a phrase that O'Connor refers to about his own childhood as love rich but cash poor.
Mm.
Um, and which is a beautiful phrase and sounds like that's sort of similar vibes to you. But I'm really interested, particularly when you transition to a private school. Did you feel more out of place because of sort of financial background, social status, or was it race, or was it a bit of both? How
I
I'm
think it
really
was both. I
yeah.
think it was both. I didn't understand that world of working towards exams or that pressure. My parents never put that pressure on us. The night before my GCSE, my dad was like, "Come on, let's go get an ice cream." And I'm like, "What are you on? Like, I've got exams."
Well, to be fair, he knew at that point you were going to read a book and get an A. So to be honest, I'm not
Yeah,
buying that. We're an
but
hour
we
into the
never
interview. I'm
had
not buying that.
that pressure.
Yeah.
And that world of, I'm gonna go horse riding at the weekend. And I was like, I'm probably just gonna go to the park or like watch a movie with my cousins. And or we've got another family function. I think it was a bit of both. And, often there was like, I think three or four. By the time I left sixth form, it was definitely five global majority girls in my year. Prior to that, probably less, but we kind of all stuck together. And I think we stuck together in that environment because it was kind not an us versus them, but it was a kind of, yeah, we kind of understand a bit more each other's worlds. But again, they came from worlds where, their parents were doctors or had high profile jobs. So yes, whilst we could relate in that sense, um, I don't think they could necessarily relate in the sense that I was just very much an average person and didn't come from this huge amount of wealth. Um, and I think for me, my childhood, when I look back on it with a lot of happiness because I didn't know any different. I didn't know any different. And I think that when I then think of my achievements that I mentioned in the beginning, they're just that little bit sweeter for me because I think, God, I really did work. I know I say like, I'll put my head down on the table, but I had to work really hard to get to where I am. And so when I speak to my students at school, I always say, you can do and be anything you want. It's not you, it doesn't matter.
Mm.
You tell me your biggest dream, we're going to make it happen.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what I love. And that's why I wanted to become a teacher because I think if I'd had a few more championing me along the way, and I did have a couple, I think, even those from the greatest disadvantage can achieve great things, far greater than I have. So yeah, that's my childhood in a nutshell.
And as the Beatles famously once sung, "Love is all you need." And that's been completely proven there. I've got to say, I'm interested to ask you one more question because when you reference the transition into private school for year
Yeah,
seven, start of secondary, which actually puts you in a very fortunate position in terms of academically and the opportunities from a schooling perspective. When I was young, I went to a grammar school, and the
yeah,
town I was in, Halifax, had I not got into that grammar school, I would have got into
yeah,
the school that was featured on a Panorama documentary
yeah.
at the time for all the wrong reasons. And had I gone there, you and I wouldn't be sitting in this room today, or it's less likely. Have you given any thought to what might have been had you not gone, and
Absolutely,
had that wonderful
absolutely. Look,
grandmother not pushed you? Yeah,
oh, this is just like music to my ears now because this is like my life passion and journey. So I live in Bedfordshire. Um, my dad had to make a huge sacrifice working abroad, being away from our family, to the detriment, of his marriage, and to put us through private education to be able to actually have a better opportunity. Now I know how hard that is. Like I've got children myself, and I'm like, how did he afford that?
yeah,
We've got pretty decent jobs. So he did that, and I think had he not done that, I would have gone to, you know, the local school, and honestly, I I couldn't tell you where my life would have taken me because I don't think I would have had any vision. I probably I don't know, Luke. And now we're like, however many years on, 20 years on, 15 years on, and actually the situation is still quite similar in Bedfordshire. The quality of education in these, other settings are not where they should be. And so a lot of parents still find themselves making huge sacrifices to send them to, the private schools that we have here because those opportunities just aren't the same in our local state schools, and that's where my life work is taking me in changing that narrative and giving every child here in this county a better opportunity, one that should be the case now. That was the story when I was a young girl. Why is that still the case now for lots of these children?
yeah.
And so that's the next part of my educational journey here, is focusing on this borough and the work that can be done here.
That is incredible. I think we've got time for one more. One more. Although I'm not sure we can top that.
Let's go
Okay.
for it.
Okay. It's not the Ofsted card. You'll be pleased to know. I'm a little bit disappointed. I was hoping, sorry. Anyway, the card says three words. It says life-changing moment.
Okay. Well, I've talked a little bit about a couple of professional life-changing moments throughout this podcast. So, like, I talked about, my life-changing moments with DEI work, um, a life-changing moment around why I switched from secondary GCSE into kind of primary, so I could have that creativity within the classroom without that stress of we've got to teach to the exam all the time. So I think I've covered those in terms of professionally. Um, I think for me, this is both probably a personal and professional life-changing moment. Was that so during COVID, my mum was diagnosed with cancer. I don't know if you actually know this, Luke, about me either. I don't think lots of people probably don't know this about me. So my mum was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer. She was incredible. She battled really, really hard. Um, but unfortunately, it came back and it was even more aggressive. Well, I don't know if it came back. She kind of got the clear, but didn't really get the clear. Um, and she said that she didn't want to continue that fight any longer. So that was her decision. Completely respected it. But why that became a life-changing moment for me was because I had just started my headship. So she was actually given the clear in the February and was like, no, you've got to go for this opportunity. It's great. Like, I'm okay, I'm good. And then by the July, because it was such an aggressive form, had been re-diagnosed and actually on my first inset as a headship, in my headship, she was undergoing surgery, a really, really invasive surgery. And I just kind of had to put that to the side and just get on with my inset. And it became a life-changing moment because it really unfolded quite rapidly with her. And, within 6 weeks of my headship, I'd, got the school turned around, did an Ofsted, and my mum was really close to dying. So I think as practitioners, we always want to do the right thing and we always think that we have to be here and we've got to stay and because we always want to do the right things by our students, which is why lots of us go into this. And I think all of us do it for the love of the children. I mean, lots of it, we don't get paid huge amounts, but we do it because we love the children and we want to improve their lives. But it became a life-changing moment for me because I realized that I have achieved quite a lot within my professional life. I'd become head teacher by the age of 30. Um, and I decided to take a period of leave and absence of leave. And I had a huge amount of guilt around just getting to that moment of making that decision. Um, and I felt awful because, you've just stepped into a headship, you've just done a great Ofsted and you want to start getting that school even, rolling even further and further down the line. But I took a period of leave and it was life changing because I kind of realized that not, there is more to life than work, of course. Um, but it was so hard in that moment to realize that there's more to life than work because work is often what gets you going through those moments of hardship. And especially for me, I really enjoy my work. So for me, work is like, I love it. I go to work, I have great time. And I'm not saying every day is great, but I thrive on that and I thrive in that environment. But just stepping back gave me that time to really refocus on that next part of my educational career, that next part of my life, that next part of the things that I really want from life. What do I want to leave this world having achieved? What do I want my mark to be? What do I want my footprints in this world to be? Um, and so for me, I realized it's great being a head teacher. I really like being a head teacher of this school, but I want more. And what I want more of is I want to leave a mark that is going to be of value.
Yeah.
So whilst I will have value in that school, that will be that moment in time. I'm only as good as my last Ofsted, right? So, you know, that school will then go on to another head teacher and another head teacher, and it will be as good as how it's being led in that moment in time. Well, I would like my work to be a bit more profound than that. I would like, all the skills that I've learned to now start impacting thousands, if not millions of children. I would like my work to impact thousands, if not millions of global majority educators. I would love global majority educators to not be in a downward trajectory and actually be an upward one and say this is a great profession to be part of. I would love to have my work, in every classroom where children think, oh my God, I love history because look at how my teachers are teaching me and I just can't wait to learn about this. Or, that's kind of the impact I want to have now. And so it was a life-changing moment because losing my mum made me realize about what mark she left on this world. And so this links into why I became a historian. So for me, going back to your original question, history, what does it mean to you? I always would tell my students, there's so many people that have lived this life and yet we don't know them and they get lost in the past and they become faceless. And I'm not saying I'm egotistical and I don't want to become faceless, because I think there's power in human insignificance as well, but I definitely want to have the impact in that whatever work I achieve is felt through generations to come. And for my mum, that will be her cooking. We will hand down those recipes, and our children will feel the love of their grandmother through the food, and so will their children, and so will their children. Just like I have the love of my grandmothers through food. But for me, I want that to be my legacy through education.
Rather, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so sorry. So sorry for the experience that you went through with your mum. Um, her getting to see you be appointed as a head, I bet was a real moment.
Yeah, it was. It was, I think my mum was proud of everything that all of us achieved, but she also, her lasting words were, if it's not for you, that's okay. Because
Yeah,
she knows that I'm somebody who often, if I'm in a situation where, that's just the conformer in me, that's the assimilating, that's my childhood, what I've taught, how I've adjusted, how I've tried to fit in and mold myself. She gave me that permission to always say, if it's not for you, that's okay. You don't have to continue. And I think she gave me that last permission to say that if you want more than a headship and that's no longer for you, that's okay. Because a headship is a great achievement, but it doesn't have to be your end point.
yeah.
So yeah, I think yeah, she was very proud of me, but she wanted me to also, if it's not for me, and I loved it. Don't get me wrong, I loved my headship. I loved it. I loved all of it. But I want more, and it's okay to say that.
And I guess that sort of naturally segues into one manner, which is well-being, because I can't think of many other sectors where you would be about to lose a parent, and a leader would first of all feel guilty.
Yeah,
And you think any other sector, it would just be completely just go. And you're right, the notion of education, particularly educational leadership, is number one wrapped with guilt, which is a big well-being debate. But also hearing you say the phrase, you're only as good as your last Ofsted, which again, where we're coming to the end of the current framework, and this framework has in itself been linked to tragedy
yeah.
for a whole number of reasons. So again, well-being, Ofsted, and your story sort of overlap. What are your thoughts on, I guess, well-being in education, particularly for leaders?
I think that there's such a high expectation that leaders will just continue to remain on that, hamster wheel. And it's a really good question that you've asked, Luke, because as a head, you're always thinking about the well-being of your staff, of your senior leaders, and you know, often in your day, nobody really asks you how you are. And even if you aren't doing well, you can't express that. You can't say, actually, I'm not so great today, or actually, my mum's had, a re-diagnosis, or my mum's got a surgery today. You can't do that because you're the leader, and so you have to lead, and you have to lead with confidence, and that vulnerability, would in many ways undermine that. Um, so I think it's really great when you can network with other leaders and you have that kind of support network. That's not always the case though, especially for many like local authority schools that are kind of standalone schools, they're not part of trusts. Um, I'm very lucky in that I've got very good support at home, and I'd always know that I've got that support at home. But again, some don't have that. But I would say that for any leader that is feeling the pressure or feeling like whatever they do isn't good enough, or that, you know, you're under that pressure because you're constantly being judged by whether that's internally your trust, externally Ofsted, you are doing your best. And if every day you know you are doing your best, that is all you can do. You are human and you only have a certain amount of hours in the day, and 8 of those you have to be resting.
Yeah.
So you must take that time to rest and not feel guilty. I remember once waking up, I literally cleared my inbox, 11 p.m., closed my eyes, woke up at 5 a.m. I mean, I slept for 6 hours and I had like 119 emails right in my inbox again. And I just remember my husband saying, no, you need to eat breakfast, get ready, they can wait. It's
Yeah.
okay. And I just thought that was really overwhelming for me in that moment. So, anyone that's feeling overwhelmed, it's okay to look after yourself as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why, one of the services we offer at the Excellence Hub is not just leadership coaching, um, but leadership supervision.
Yeah,
There's a reason why supervision existed initially through clinicians, now through
yeah.
safeguarding leads, but actually school leaders. Rather, we've covered so many phenomenal topics today, from history to DI to childhood to life-changing moments, and some common themes and some common overlaps throughout. Um, you have been an incredible guest. You are an incredible human being. I'm so excited to see your new research and to see the mark and the footprints you'll continue to leave on our world. And thank you so much for joining me on this very special episode.
Thank you so much, Luke. And if anybody's interested in any of my work, you can follow me on LinkedIn. But more importantly, you can find me through the Excellence Hub, and reach out to me via the Excellence Hub. And I look forward to hearing from many of you and your thoughts on this podcast as well. I'm sure there's going to be lots of conversation around the history stuff, but I can't wait for it. So, yeah, let's get the conversation going.
Let's do that. And if any behaviour leads watching, thinking next time you see children throwing paper balls at each other, before you remove them from a
They
lesson,
are learning, they
it,
could be learning.
it may well be an intercontinental ballistic missile.
Missile.
Exactly. Rather, take care. Great to talk to you.
Take care. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.